It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that seemed to reflect the state of mind of someone about to go through something heavy. Alexander Blackwood, a man as rich as he was arrogant, paced back and forth in the living room of his mansion. He was furious. No, furious was an understatement. He was livid. Isabella, sitting on the couch, looked at him with tears streaming down her face. She tried to explain, begged for understanding, but Alexander didn't want to hear any of it. He could only think of one thing. She couldn't give him an heir. Or, at least, that's what he thought. You know what having a child means to me, Isabella? An heir? Someone to carry on the Blackwood legacy. His voice echoed through the room, sharp as a knife. But you disappointed me. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to hold back her sobs. Alexander, I did everything I could. I saw doctors, specialists, but sometimes things just don't go as we plan. He shook his head, as if her words were poison. Don't give me excuses. You knew what I expected when we got married. And now? What am I supposed to do now? Then he said something that would change everything forever. I can't stay with you anymore, Isabella. You can't give me what I need. Every word hit like a punch, leaving her breathless. He grabbed his coat, threw it over his shoulders, and walked out the door without looking back. Isabella remained there, alone, with the sound of rain hitting the windows and her heart in pieces. She knew this day would come, but she never imagined it would be so cruel. It felt like the world had collapsed on her. The following months were a blur of tears and loneliness. She left the mansion, sold everything she had, and moved to a small town in the countryside. There, she found peace where she least expected it. She met simple people who didn't care about money or family names, people who welcomed her without judgment. But there was something Isabella still kept inside, a secret she swore never to tell, a secret that could change everything. Meanwhile, Alexander moved on. Or, at least, he tried to. He married Victoria, an ambitious socialite who knew exactly how to manipulate his weaknesses. She was beautiful, yes, but also cold as ice. Together, they made the perfect couple in the eyes of the world, but behind closed doors, the truth was different. Alexander was trapped in a golden cage. He had everything money could buy, but he felt an emptiness that not even Victoria could fill. Sometimes he thought about Isabella, about how things could have been different, but he quickly pushed those thoughts away, convinced he had made the right decision. Until one day, while flipping through a newspaper looking for distraction, something caught his attention. A photo, small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to make his heart stop. It was Isabella. She was in a park, surrounded by two children, two little girls who were identical, laughing and playing as if the world was a magical place. Alexander froze. Who were those children? How had Isabella moved on so quickly? And why, for the love of God, did they look so familiar? He didn't know it yet, but that image was about to change everything, more than he could ever imagine. Alexander was not a man who hesitated. When something caught his attention, he went after it. And that photo wouldn't leave his mind. It was like a puzzle with a missing piece, something that unsettled him deep in his soul. He needed to know more. So, without thinking twice, he got in his car and drove for hours to the small town where Isabella was. The place was completely different from the world he knew. Simple houses, quiet streets, smiling people. It felt like time had stopped there, while in his life, everything moved at high speed. He found her in the park, just like in the photo. Isabella was sitting on a bench, watching the two little girls play. They ran, laughed, shouted. It was as if the sound of their laughter filled the air around them. Alexander froze for a moment, hidden behind a tree, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. It was strange. Those children had something of him. He couldn't quite explain it, but it felt familiar, as if they were part of something he once knew but had forgotten. Finally, he took a deep breath and walked toward her. Isabella looked up, and when she saw him, it was as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She turned pale, frozen in place, as if she were seeing a ghost. "Alexander?" Her voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, trying to find words that wouldn't come, until one of the little girls, Sophie, he would later learn, ran up to him, curious. "Who are you?" the girl asked with that innocent tone only children have. Alexander blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected this. He wasn't prepared to face those big, curious eyes that were just like his. I'm. He stammered, unsure of what to say. Isabella quickly intervened, pulling Sophie close. "He's just an acquaintance, sweetheart. Go play with your sister." But it was too late. The gears were already turning in Alexander's head. He looked at Isabella, then at the girls, then back at her. "Are they your daughters?" he asked, his voice tense. Isabella hesitated. She knew that question was coming, but she wasn't ready to answer it. "Yes," she finally said, avoiding his gaze. "And who is their father?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She met his eyes, a mix of anger and pain in her expression. "That's none of your business, Alexander." He felt a knot in his throat. There was something in the way she said it, something that made him suspicious. But before he could press further, Emma, the other twin, came running up, holding a ball. "Mommy, Sophie doesn't want to share." Isabella sighed, relieved by the distraction. "Come on, girls, it's time to go home." The twins started protesting, but she gently led them away, casting one last glance at Alexander. A look that said many things, but most of all, "Stay away from us." Alexander stood there, motionless, watching them walk away. He felt something inside him, something he couldn't explain, a feeling that there was much more to this story than Isabella was willing to reveal. Back at the mansion, he couldn't get those images out of his head. The girls' laughter, their curious eyes, the way Isabella tried to hide the truth. He started digging into everything he could about her, searching for clues, old documents, medical records, anything that could help him understand what was going on. And then one night, while sifting through old papers in his office, he found something that made his heart stop. An old document forgotten in a dusty folder. It was a medical report dated 5 years ago, a fertility treatment done by Isabella. Alexander felt his blood run cold. He read and reread the document, trying to comprehend. It was impossible. She had told him she couldn't have children, that they would never be able to start a family. But there, on that piece of paper, was proof that she had lied. Or had she? He started putting the pieces together. If Isabella had undergone treatment, why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept it to herself? And more importantly, those girls, were they really his? Doubt consumed him. He needed answers. He needed to confront her again. But this time, he wouldn't let her escape so easily. Meanwhile, Victoria had begun to notice something was off. Alexander was distant, distracted, obsessed with something she didn't understand. She had seen him going through old papers, making strange phone calls. And then one night, while he was in his office, she decided to investigate. What she found would change everything. Everything. Victoria wasn't naive. She knew something was going on with Alexander, and it unsettled her deeply. He had been acting strange, distant, as if he were hiding something or someone. And when she saw that medical document on his desk, she knew she was right. She picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the lines as her heart pounded. Fertility? Isabella? That didn't make sense. Or maybe it made far more sense than she wanted to admit. A chill ran down Victoria's spine. She knew Alexander's secrets well. After all, it was because of them that she had managed to trap him in a loveless marriage. But this was different. This could destroy everything. She slipped the document into her pocket, determined to find out more. If there was one thing Victoria excelled at, it was manipulating the people around her, and she would use that to protect what was hers. Meanwhile, Alexander was growing more obsessed with the truth. He couldn't stop thinking about the twins, their eyes, the way they seemed to be a part of him. It was as if the universe was trying to tell him something, but he still couldn't fully understand it. The next day, he returned to the small town where Isabella lived. This time, he wasn't leaving without answers. He found her at home, a simple house with flowers in the garden and colorful curtains in the windows. It looked so different from the life they had before, yet it also seemed perfect. He knocked on the door, and Isabella opened it, surprised to see him there again. "Alexander, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm. "It's important." She hesitated for a moment, but eventually let him in. The twins were playing in the yard, unaware of the tension in the air. "What do you want?" Isabella asked, crossing her arms. Alexander took a deep breath. "I know about the fertility treatment." Isabella went pale. How did you find out?" "That doesn't matter," he said impatiently. "What matters is that you lied to me. You made me believe you couldn't have children. But now I know that wasn't true." She lowered her gaze, unable to look at him. "You don't understand, Alexander. I did it because I needed a chance to be happy, to build something that was just mine. And then you left me. You abandoned me when I needed you the most. But the girls—" He cut her off, his voice shaking. "Are they mine?" Isabella hesitated. She wanted to deny it, to protect her daughters from the pain Alexander could bring. But she knew she couldn't lie forever. "Yes," she finally admitted, almost in a whisper. "They're yours." Alexander felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. He had two daughters he never knew existed. And Isabella had kept them from him for 5 years. "Why?" he asked, his voice full of pain. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't want me," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "You rejected me. Alexander, you abandoned me because I wasn't good enough for you. So how could I trust you? How could I risk my daughters' hearts with someone who only thinks about himself?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right, at least in part. He had been selfish, arrogant, blinded by his own pride. But now he wanted to fix things. "I know I made mistakes, Isabella," he said, his voice low. "I know I hurt you, but I want to change. I want to be part of my daughters' lives. I want to be the father they deserve." Isabella shook her head, unconvinced. "You can't just show up after 5 years and expect everything to be fine. You have no idea what I went through, what they went through. You don't know anything about us." Before Alexander could respond, laughter rang out from the yard. Sophie and Emma came running inside, covered in dirt, happy and carefree. When they saw Alexander, they stopped, curious. "Daddy," Sophie exclaimed, pointing at him. "You came to see us again." Emma frowned. "Daddy? He's not our daddy." "Sophie?" Alexander felt his heart clench. He wanted to hold them, to explain everything, but he knew this wasn't the right moment. Not yet. Isabella quickly led the girls to another room, preventing the situation from becoming even more complicated. When she returned, she was visibly shaken. "You need to leave," she said firmly. Now, Alexander knew there was no point in arguing. He left, but he promised himself he wouldn't give up. Not this time. Back at the mansion, Victoria was waiting for him. She had a smile on her face, but her eyes were as cold as ice. "So," she said, crossing her arms, "you have 2 daughters, Alexander? How interesting." He stared at her, shocked. "How do you know that?" "I know many things," she replied, taking a step forward. "And if you think you can just walk away from everything because of these children, you're very mistaken. Don't you dare threaten my family," he said, his voice dark. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your family? Oh, Alexander, you still don't get it, do you? This family is you and me, and I won't let anyone get in the way of that." She walked out of the room, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts. He knew Victoria would do anything to protect what she considered hers, but he also knew he wasn't going to give up on his daughters, no matter what it took. Alexander was caught in a whirlwind. Victoria's words echoed in his mind like a relentless bell. She knew, she had always known. And worse, she was willing to do whatever it took to keep things the way they were. But Alexander was no longer the same man who had abandoned Isabella 5 years ago. He had changed. Or, at least, he wanted to believe he had. Now he had 2 daughters, 2 little girls who deserved to know who he was. And he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Victoria, stand in the way of that. That night, he barely slept. He tossed and turned, thinking about the twins, about Isabella, about everything that had happened. He needed to act fast before Victoria did something he would regret forever. The next day, he decided to return to the small town where Isabella lived. But this time, he wasn't going alone. He hired a private investigator to dig into everything. Her past, the fertility treatment, anything that could help him understand what had really happened. A few days later, the detective handed him a detailed report. And what Alexander discovered was revealing. Isabella had undergone the treatment in secret because she feared he would reject her. She knew how obsessed he was with having an heir, and believed that if he found out she needed medical help to conceive, it would only confirm his suspicion that she wasn't good enough for him. But there was more. So much more. The report showed that Isabella had tried to tell him the truth multiple times, but backed out of fear of his reaction. She had even written letters she never sent, explaining everything. Alexander felt a lump in his throat as he read those words. It was as if he was seeing Isabella for the first time, not as the woman he had left behind, but as someone who had fought alone, carrying the weight of a secret that could have destroyed her. He got in his car again and drove to her house. When he arrived, he found Isabella in the garden, tending to her flowers. She looked up when she saw him, surprised. "You again?" she asked, irritation and exhaustion mixed in her voice. "I need to show you something," he said, extending the investigator's report. Isabella frowned in confusion. She took the papers and started reading. As she went through them, her eyes widened more and more. By the time she finished, she was trembling. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't matter how," he replied. "What matters is that I know the truth now. I know what you went through, what you tried to do. And I'm sorry, Isabella. I'm sorry for being so selfish, so blind." She lowered her gaze, unable to look at him. "That doesn't change anything, Alexander. You left me, you abandoned me when I needed you most. How can I trust you now?" "I know it won't be easy," he admitted, "but I want to try. I want to be part of our daughters' lives. I want to fix this, even if it takes time." Isabella hesitated. She wanted to believe him, but she was afraid. Afraid that he would leave again, that he would hurt Sophie and Emma the way he had hurt her. Meanwhile, Victoria wasn't sitting idly by. She knew Alexander was getting closer to Isabella and the twins, and it infuriated her. She wasn't about to lose everything she had fought for, at least not without a fight. She hired someone to spread lies about Isabella in the small town. Rumors began circulating that Isabella was a gold digger, that she had gotten pregnant on purpose to extort money from Alexander. People started looking at her differently, whispering behind her back. Isabella noticed what was happening, but she had no way to prove Victoria was behind it. She tried to ignore it, but the twins started feeling the impact. At school, other children began teasing them, calling them names, and excluding them from games. One day, Sophie and Emma came home crying, saying no one wanted to play with them. Isabella's heart broke, seeing her daughter suffer for something that wasn't their fault. "Why are people being so mean to us, Mommy?" Sophie asked, wiping away her tears. Isabella hugged them tightly, trying to comfort them. "Don't worry, my love. This will pass. What matters is that we love each other, right?" But deep down, she knew this wasn't going to end anytime soon. Victoria was playing dirty, and Isabella didn't know how to fight back. Alexander, on the other hand, started noticing what was happening. He saw the false rumors spreading, saw how Isabella was being attacked, and he knew Victoria was responsible. "You're not getting away with this," he told her during a tense dinner at the mansion. Victoria laughed, as if she didn't care. "Oh, Alexander, do you really think you can take me on? I have far more to lose than you can imagine. You're not going to hurt anyone else." He shot back, his voice firm. "I will protect my daughters, no matter what it takes." Their eyes locked in a furious battle of wills, and it became clear this war was far from over. Victoria was not a woman of empty threats. When she said she would do something, she did it. And she did it with style. And now, with Alexander clearly determined to win Isabella back and get closer to the twins, she knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let him slip through her fingers, even if it meant completely ruining Isabella's life. She began crafting an even more elaborate plan. Spreading rumors wasn't enough. She wanted to strike Isabella where it hurt the most, her reputation and her heart. Victoria knew that the people in that small town were easily swayed, especially when money or status was involved. So she decided to use that to her advantage. One morning, while Isabella was busy helping Sophie and Emma get ready for school, there was a knock on the door. A formally dressed man stood there, carrying a black briefcase. He handed her an official letter and left without saying a word. Isabella frowned, curious, and opened the envelope. Inside was a court notice. Victoria had filed a lawsuit against her, accusing Isabella of attempting to extort money from Alexander under false pretenses. The accusation was absurd, but Victoria had the resources and the right connections to make it look convincing. Isabella felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. How had Victoria managed to fabricate something so cruel? She knew it was a setup, but how could she prove it? The words on the letter felt heavy as stones, and she could barely breathe. "Mommy, are you okay?" Emma asked, tugging at her skirt. Isabella forced a smile, trying to mask the storm of emotions inside her. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Let's finish getting ready. Okay?" But she knew this was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Alexander was furious. He found out about the lawsuit through his lawyers and immediately confronted Victoria. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he shouted, slamming his hand on the desk in her office. "How dare you do this to Isabella? To my daughters?" Victoria crossed her arms, a cold smile on her lips. "Oh, Alexander, I'm just protecting what's ours. You know she's nothing but an opportunist." "Why are you defending that woman?" "Because she is the mother of my children," he shot back, his voice echoing through the room. "And because I know you're behind this, I won't let you destroy their lives." Victoria laughed. But there was something dark in her amusement. Do you really think you can go up against me? Do you have any idea what I can do to you, Alexander? I know all your secrets. Every single one. He froze for a moment. Yes, she knew things about him. Things that could ruin his reputation, his career, everything he had built. But he also knew he couldn't keep living under her control. Do whatever you want, he finally said, his voice low but firm. But I will never give up on my daughters. No matter what it costs me. Their eyes locked in a fierce battle of wills. And it was clear this was the point of no return. Victoria wasn't going to back down. And neither was Alexander. Meanwhile, Isabella was trying to keep up appearances for the twins. She knew they were already struggling with the rumors at school, and now this, a lawsuit? She had no idea how to explain that to two 5-year-olds. Sophie, Emma, come here, she called, sitting down on the couch with them. I need to talk to you. The girls approached, curious. What is it, Mommy? You know, that sometimes people can be mean, right? They can say things about us that aren't true. She hesitated, searching for the right words. Well, some people are saying bad things about me right now. But I want you to know that none of it is true. Mommy loves you more than anything in the world. And nothing will ever change that. Sophie frowned. But why are people being mean to us? Because some people don't like seeing others happy, Isabella explained, pulling them into a hug. But we won't let that affect us, right? We're strong. The twins nodded, but it was clear they were confused and hurt. Isabella felt her heart clench, but she knew she had to be strong for them. The following week, the case began gaining traction in the local media. Newspapers and websites started publishing sensationalized articles about the Blackwood scandal. Pictures of Isabella were everywhere, accompanied by headlines like "Ex-wife attempts to extort billionaire" and "Who is the real victim?" Alexander saw it all and felt his anger boil over. He knew Victoria was behind this, and it only strengthened his resolve to fight for Isabella and the twins. He decided to take drastic action. He assembled his best lawyers and built a strong defense for Isabella. He also started digging into Victoria's business dealings, determined to find something he could use against her. That's when he discovered something that would change everything, something Victoria never imagined he would find. Alexander sat in his office, surrounded by papers and documents. He had spent days buried in investigations about Victoria, digging through every detail of her business dealings, searching for something he could use against her. And then, finally, he found it. It was a bank transfer, a massive sum of money sent to an offshore account just months before the rumors about Isabella had started. At first glance, it seemed like just another one of Victoria's shady transactions. After all, she had always had a talent for moving money without raising suspicion. But there was something different about this one. The recipient of the transfer was a familiar name, the same man who had delivered the court notice to Isabella. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. This was no coincidence. Victoria had paid someone to file a lawsuit against Isabella, creating this entire mess just to keep her away from him. It was dirty, low, but completely predictable coming from her. He grabbed his phone and called his lawyers immediately. "I need you here now," he said, his voice firm. "I found something that could change everything." When the lawyers arrived, Alexander laid out the evidence. They were both impressed and concerned. "This is serious," one of them said, adjusting his glasses as he analyzed the documents. "If this comes to light, Victoria could face major legal trouble." "Exactly," Alexander replied, a cold smile forming on his lips. "And I'm going to make sure it does." Meanwhile, Isabella was struggling to cope with the chaos surrounding her. The media coverage was getting worse, and the townspeople were becoming increasingly hostile. She tried to shield the twins, but it was almost impossible. Sophie and Emma had started noticing that something was wrong. The children at school avoided them, and even some of the mothers looked at Isabella with suspicion. One day, as she walked down the street with the girls, she heard someone whisper, "That woman has no shame." She froze, trying to ignore it, but the tears welled up in her eyes. Sophie and Emma noticed and immediately ran to hug her. "Mommy, why are people being so mean?" Emma asked, her eyes filled with tears. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I don't know, sweetheart, but remember this. We know who we are. No matter what people say, we are good, and we love each other very much." But inside, she was crumbling. How could she protect her daughters from something this big? How could she fight against someone like Victoria? Victoria, on the other hand, was confident. She believed she had Alexander trapped. He could try to help Isabella, but she had too many secrets to be exposed. Or at least that's what she thought. One night, while dining alone in her mansion, she received an unexpected phone call. The number was unknown, but she answered anyway. "Mrs. Blackwood." A male voice said on the other end, "We should have a chat." Victoria frowned. "Who is this?" "Just someone who knows what you've been up to," the man replied, his tone laced with warning. "You should be more careful about who you hire, Mrs. Blackwood. Some people talk too much." Her heart pounded. She knew exactly what he was referring to. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "Let's just say I have information your husband might find very interesting," the man said with a low chuckle, "and I'm willing to sell it to the highest bidder." Victoria hung up, furious. Who was this man? How had he gotten that information? She needed to act fast before everything spiraled out of control. The next day, she decided to confront Alexander directly. She stormed into his office without knocking, her eyes blazing with fury. "You're up to something," she snapped, pointing a finger at him. "I know you are." Alexander raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Whatever are you talking about, Victoria?" "Don't play dumb," she shot back, slamming her hand on his desk. "Someone is meddling in my business. Someone is trying to take me down. And I know you're behind it." He stared at her in silence for a moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "You know, Victoria, maybe it's time you learned a lesson. You can't manipulate people forever." Her eyes widened. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I would," he said, his voice eerily calm. "And if you ever try to hurt Isabella or my daughters again, I promise you'll regret it." Victoria stormed out of the office, both furious and shaken. She knew Alexander meant every word, and she knew she had to do something drastic to protect herself. Later that night, Victoria decided to take an extreme measure. She hired a private investigator to follow Isabella and the twins, hoping to find something she could use against them. But what she didn't expect was that the investigator would uncover something even more shocking. While observing Isabella, the detective noticed something odd, an old letter tucked away in a box in her attic. When he managed to obtain a copy of the document, he was stunned. It was a letter written by Isabella years ago, a letter that proved she had tried to tell Alexander the truth about the twins, but had backed out of fear of his reaction. Victoria's lips curled into a triumphant smile as she read the investigator's report. This was exactly what she needed. Now, she had something that could destroy Isabella once and for all. Victoria was radiant. Finally, she had something that could destroy Isabella, and by extension, Alexander. That old letter was the perfect proof that Isabella had deliberately hidden the twins, even after initially trying to tell the truth. It was the kind of secret that could ruin any chance of reconciliation between Alexander and his ex-wife. But Victoria wasn't foolish. She knew she had to use this information carefully. She couldn't simply hand the letter to Alexander and expect him to come running back into her arms. No, she needed to craft a narrative, something that would make Isabella look even more guilty than she already did. So, she decided to host a dinner party, an elegant affair filled with influential people, journalists, business leaders, and prominent figures of high society. And, of course, Alexander would be there. It was the perfect opportunity to expose Isabella in front of everyone. Meanwhile, Isabella was struggling to stay calm. Things were getting more difficult by the day. Victoria's lawsuit was moving forward, and the rumors in town were only getting worse. The twins were suffering at school, and Isabella felt as if she were failing as a mother. "Sophie, Emma, come here," she called, trying to keep her voice steady as she served breakfast. "I need you to promise me something." The girls looked at her, curious. "What is it, Mommy?" "Promise me that no matter what happens, you will stay strong. Promise me that you'll trust me. Okay?" She tried to smile, but it was hard to hide the weight she carried in her heart. Sophie nodded, determination in her eyes. "We promise, Mommy." Emma, however, hesitated. "But what if people keep being mean to us?" Isabella knelt down to their level, taking their hands in hers. "I know it's hard, my love, but remember this. We are a family, and families stand by each other, no matter what." The twins hugged her, and Isabella closed her eyes, trying to hold on to that moment of tenderness. She knew she had to be strong for her daughters, but she also knew an even bigger storm was coming. That evening, Victoria's dinner party was a grand event. The Blackwood mansion was lit up like never before, with waiters circulating through the halls, offering champagne and canapes. Guests chatted excitedly, unaware that they were about to witness something explosive. Alexander arrived reluctantly. He knew Victoria was up to something, but he had no idea what. The moment he stepped into the main hall, she approached him with a seductive smile. "Darling, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, slipping her arm through his. "I have a special surprise for you tonight." He frowned, suspicious. "What kind of surprise?" "You'll see," she replied, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Shortly after, Victoria stepped onto a small, makeshift stage in the center of the hall and called for silence. All eyes turned to her, curious. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and controlled. "Tonight, I would like to share something very important with all of you, something that involves my husband, Alexander Blackwood, and someone many of you may have seen in the headlines recently." The guests murmured, intrigued. Alexander felt a knot tighten in his chest. He knew this wouldn't end well. Victoria picked up a golden envelope and pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a letter written by Isabella, Alexander's ex-wife. A letter that proves she knew about the twins from the very beginning, and that she deliberately hid them from him." For a moment, the hall fell silent before exploding into shocked whispers. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He looked at Victoria, stunned. "How did you get that?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Victoria smiled triumphantly. "Let's just say that some truths have a way of coming to light, darling. And now, everyone can see who Isabella really is." Anger bubbled inside Alexander. He knew Victoria was manipulating the situation, but he also knew he needed to get the full story before making any decisions. Later that night, he went to Isabella's house. He needed to hear the truth from her. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see him there. "Alexander, what are you doing here?" she asked, clearly shaken. "I need you to explain this to me," he said, handing her the letter Victoria had revealed at the dinner. Isabella paled as she read the words she had written years ago. I didn't want you to find out like this," she murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "Then explain it to me," he demanded, his voice tense. Why didn't you tell me about the twins? She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I tried, Alexander. I wrote that letter when I found out I was pregnant, but then I realized you would never take me back. You left me because you thought I couldn't give you an heir. I knew that if you found out I needed treatment to get pregnant, it would only confirm everything you already believed about me. He stared at her, processing her words. You should have given me a chance, he finally said, pain lacing his voice. I know, she admitted, lowering her gaze. But I was scared, Alexander. Scared that you would reject our daughters. The two stood in silence for a moment, lost in their thoughts. Then Sophie and Emma appeared in the room, curious about what was happening. Daddy? Sophie asked hesitantly. Alexander looked at the twins, his heart clenching. He knew he had to make things right, not just for Isabella, but for them. Alexander was at a point of no return. He knew he needed to make a decision. And fast. Victoria had played all her cards, exposing Isabella in front of everyone at the dinner party. But at the same time, he had enough evidence to reveal his wife's cruel manipulations. He spent the entire night awake, replaying Isabella's words in his mind. She had been afraid of him, afraid of being rejected again. And now, with the twins involved, he realized he could no longer run from the consequences of his own mistakes. It was time to face the truth. All of it. The next morning, he called an emergency meeting with his lawyers. I want to start the divorce process, he said firmly, and I want Victoria exposed for everything she's done. The lawyers exchanged concerned glances. Mr. Blackwood, this is going to be a massive scandal. One of them warned. Are you sure this is what you want? I am, Alexander replied without hesitation. I won't let her keep hurting the people I love. Enough is enough. Meanwhile, Victoria was confident. She thought she had won. The dinner had been a success, and she was sure that Alexander would finally see Isabella for who she really was. Or at least for who Victoria wanted him to believe she was. But when she received the official divorce papers, her world came crashing down. She read through the documents furiously, realizing that Alexander had solid evidence against her. Bank transfers, forged contracts, even messages she had exchanged with the man who had served Isabella's court notice. She called Alexander immediately. What the hell are you doing? She screamed, her voice trembling with rage. You can't just abandon me like this. I can, and I will, he replied, his voice cold as ice. You've crossed every line, Victoria. I won't let you destroy any more lives. You'll regret this, she threatened, trying to regain control. I know your secrets, Alexander. Things that could ruin you. Then go ahead. He shot back without flinching. But know this. If you come after me, I'll make sure the whole world sees who you really are. And trust me, Victoria, that will hurt you far more than it will hurt me. Victoria hung up, furious and terrified. She knew Alexander was serious. He was no longer the man she could easily manipulate. He had changed. Meanwhile, Isabella was trying to rebuild her life. After the public humiliation at the dinner, things had only gotten worse in town. People started avoiding her house, and Sophie and Emma continued to suffer at school. She knew she needed to leave, but she had nowhere to go. One day, while walking through the park with the twins, she saw Alexander sitting on a bench. He looked exhausted but determined. Isabella, he called out, standing up when he saw her. We need to talk. She hesitated but eventually approached. About what? About us, he said, glancing at the twins. I know I made a lot of mistakes in the past. Mistakes that hurt you and our daughters. But I want to fix that. I want to be in their lives. In your life, Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but she was still afraid. And Victoria? I'm divorcing her, he said firmly. She will never hurt us again. The twins watched the conversation closely. Sophie tugged at Isabella's hand. Mommy, can we trust him? Isabella looked into Alexander's eyes, seeing the sincerity there. I don't know, sweetheart. Only time will tell. Later that week, Victoria made one last desperate move. She hired someone to spread even worse rumors about Isabella, this time involving the twins. The story spread quickly, and soon the girls were facing even more intense bullying at school. One afternoon, Sophie came home in tears, clutching a cruel note someone had slipped into her backpack. Why are people saying we're not normal, Mommy? Isabella pulled her daughter into a comforting embrace. Don't listen to them, my love. None of it is true. But Emma was unusually quiet. Mommy, maybe we should just leave. This town doesn't like us. Isabella felt her heart break. Emma was right. Maybe it was time to start over somewhere else. When Alexander found out what was happening, he stormed into the school. He confronted the principal, demanding action to protect Sophie and Emma. When that didn't work, he used his influence to put pressure on the local authorities. These girls are my daughters, he said firmly, and I won't allow them to be victims of bullying any longer. The situation improved temporarily, but Alexander knew it wasn't enough. He needed to get Isabella and the twins out of that town. He needed to give them a fresh start. By the end of the week, he went to Isabella's house again. I bought a house for you, he said, handing her the keys. It's in another city, far from all of this. It's safe, and the girls can start fresh there. Isabella looked at him, stunned. Why are you doing this? Because I want you to be safe, he said sincerely. And because I want the chance to be the father they deserve. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Alexander. We'll accept your help. The twins ran to hug him. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt like he was finally doing the right thing. But Victoria wasn't done yet. She was planning something bigger, something that could change everything forever. Victoria was furious. No, furious didn't even cover it. She was on fire, like a volcano ready to erupt. Everything she had built, her luxurious life, her marriage to Alexander, her control over him, was crumbling before her eyes. And she knew she needed to do something big, something that no one would ever forget. She began plotting her most daring plan yet. If Alexander wanted to be with Isabella and the twins, then she would make sure he could never touch them again. Never again. One night, while everyone was asleep, Victoria sent a message to a man she knew well, someone who didn't ask questions as long as the payment was good. She gave him clear instructions: bring me the twins, alive. Meanwhile, Isabella and the girls were preparing for the move. The new house Alexander had bought for them was simple but cozy. It was located in a quiet town, far from the rumors and people who had judged them so harshly. It was exactly what they needed. The twins were excited about starting fresh. Sophie and Emma ran through the empty house, imagining where they would place their toys and books. Isabella watched them with a tired but grateful smile. It's going to be good here, Sophie said, hugging her mother. We'll be happy, right? Isabella nodded, trying to push aside the dark thoughts still lingering in her mind. Yes, sweetheart, we will be happy. But deep down, she knew Victoria's threat still hung over them. She trusted Alexander. Yes, but she also knew that Victoria was capable of anything. That night, as the twins slept soundly, Isabella sat in the living room, staring out the window. She heard a strange noise coming from the backyard and went to investigate. When she opened the door, she found Alexander standing there, a worried expression on his face. Alexander, she asked, surprised. What are you doing here? I had to see you, he replied, quickly stepping inside. I have a bad feeling about Victoria. She's plotting something, and I fear the worst. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Do you think she's coming after the girls? He hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Yes, I think she would do anything to hurt me. We need to stay alert. They both decided to keep watch through the night, taking turns to guard the house. But even so, sleep wasn't easy to come by. In the middle of the night, as Isabella dozed off on the couch, Sophie woke up frightened. She heard footsteps outside the house and went to the window to see what it was. When she looked into the backyard, she saw two hooded figures moving stealthily toward the back door. "Mommy!" she screamed, running to wake Isabella. "There's someone outside." Isabella woke up immediately, her heart racing. She grabbed Sophie and ran to the room where Emma was still sleeping. She woke the other twin quickly and hid them both under the bed. "Don't come out no matter what happens," she whispered urgently. Then there was a loud noise. The back door had been broken open. Alexander, who was downstairs, heard the sound and rushed to confront the intruders. He found two masked men rummaging through the kitchen. "Who are you?" he demanded firmly, blocking their path. The men didn't answer. Instead, they lunged at him, determined to complete the mission Victoria had given them. A violent struggle began. Alexander was strong, but the men were trained. He managed to take one down, but the other hit him hard, leaving him dazed. Meanwhile, Isabella heard the sounds of the fight and knew she needed to act. She grabbed a heavy pan from the kitchen and hurried down the stairs, ready to face the intruders. "Get out of here!" she yelled, swinging the pan at one of the men, knocking him out cold. The other man hesitated for a moment, but then tried to flee. Isabella chased after him, but he had already escaped through the back door. Alexander, still dizzy, managed to get up. "Are you okay?" he asked, panting. "I'm fine," she replied, helping him steady himself. But they were after the girls. They both ran to the room where the twins were hiding. Sophie and Emma crawled out from under the bed, trembling with fear. "Daddy! Mommy!" they cried, rushing to hug them. Alexander held his daughters tightly, his heart breaking. "I promise this will never happen again," he said, his voice choked. Later, the police arrived at the house. The officers arrested the man who had been knocked out and began investigating the case. Alexander told them everything he knew about Victoria, handing over all the evidence he had gathered against her. "This woman is dangerous," he told the lead detective. "She won't stop until she gets what she wants." The detective nodded. "Seriously, we'll find her. But until then, you need to stay somewhere safe." The next day, Alexander decided to take Isabella and the twins to a safe hideout, a remote house owned by a trusted friend. There, they could stay protected while the police hunted for Victoria. But Victoria wasn't easy to find. She had disappeared completely, leaving behind nothing but a trail of destruction. Meanwhile, the news picked up the story of the attack. Journalists speculated about Victoria's involvement, but there was still not enough evidence to arrest her officially. Isabella watched everything unfold with a mix of relief and worry. She knew it wasn't over. Victoria was still out there, somewhere planning her next move. Sophie and Emma, on the other hand, seemed calmer now that they were far from the city. They played in the garden of the new house, laughing and running as if nothing had happened. "They're strong," Alexander said, watching the girls from the window. "Real survivors." Isabella smiled, agreeing. "Yes, they are. But I just want this to end. I want them to grow up without fear." Alexander looked into her eyes. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure that happens." But deep down, they both knew that the battle was far from over. Victoria was out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The following days were a mix of tension and hope. Alexander, Isabella, and the twins were hiding in the remote house, trying to rebuild some form of normality amid the chaos. But it was impossible to ignore the shadow Victoria still cast over their lives. Every strange noise outside, every unfamiliar car that passed by, kept everyone on edge. Sophie and Emma, however, seemed determined not to let fear control them. They played in the garden, drew on the ground with colored chalk, and filled the house with their joyful laughter. It was as if they instinctively knew that the love of family was stronger than any threat. But Isabella and Alexander knew that this couldn't last forever. They needed to face Victoria once and for all. Meanwhile, Victoria was in her own hideout, a rented apartment in a distant city. She had cut her hair, changed its color, and even adopted sunglasses to avoid being recognized. But despite her different appearance, she was still burning with rage. "I won't let him abandon me like this," she muttered to herself, flipping through newspapers that reported the attack on Isabella's house. "He's going to pay for this." She began planning her next move. This time, she decided to act alone. No more henchmen, no more intermediaries. She wanted to face Alexander face to face and show him what happened when someone betrayed her. At the remote house, Alexander received an unexpected call. It was the detective who had been investigating Victoria. "Mr. Blackwood, we found something important," the man said urgently. "Victoria is in a city just a few hours away. We believe she's preparing for something big." Alexander's heart raced. "Thank you. I'm on my way." "Wait," the detective interrupted. "Don't go alone. This woman is dangerous." But Alexander had already made his decision. He wouldn't let Victoria keep threatening his family. He needed to put an end to this once and for all. When he told Isabella about his plans, she was furious. "You can't go alone. She's crazy, Alexander." "I know," he replied, holding her hands, "but I have to do this. For you, for the girls. I won't let her control us forever." Isabella hesitated, but then nodded. "Be careful, please." That very night, Alexander left. He drove for hours until he reached the city where Victoria was hiding. Following the clues the detective had given him, he found her apartment. When he knocked on the door, Victoria opened it with a cold smile on her face. "I knew you would come," she said, almost triumphantly. "It's over, Victoria," he replied firmly. "You're not going to hurt anyone again." She laughed, but there was something desperate in her laughter. "You really think you can stop me? I am part of you, Alexander. I always will be." "No," he retorted calmly. "You were just a mistake I made. A mistake I'm going to fix now." Victoria frowned, realizing he was serious. She tried to close the door, but Alexander pushed his way into the apartment. "You can't run from this," he said firmly. "You're going to pay for what you did." She stared at him for a moment before finally giving in. "Fine," she murmured, defeated. "You win." Later, the police arrived at the apartment and arrested Victoria. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she knew there was no escape. As she was taken away in handcuffs, she looked at Alexander with hatred in her eyes. "You'll regret this," she whispered before getting into the police car. But Alexander felt no fear. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Back at the remote house, Isabella and the twins anxiously awaited news. When Alexander finally arrived, they ran to hug him. "Are you okay?" Isabella asked, tears in her eyes. "Yes," he replied, holding her tightly. "She'll never hurt us again." The twins jumped into his arms, laughing and shouting with joy. It was a moment of unity, of true love, something they had never felt before. In the months that followed, life began to return to normal. Isabella and the twins moved into a new house, and Alexander started visiting them regularly. He was learning to be the father he had always should have been, and the girls were beginning to trust him. One day, while watching Sophie and Emma play in the garden, Isabella approached Alexander. "I want to thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything you've done for us." He shook his head. "I should be the one thanking you. You showed me what really matters in life." She smiled, touched by his words. I used to think love was based on superficial things, money, status, appearances. But now I see that true love is about acceptance, about being there for someone even when things get tough." Alexander agreed. "Yes, and I just hope we can keep building this family together." Isabella hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I hope so too." In the end, they learned a valuable lesson. The true worth of life isn't in what you own, but in the connections you make and the love you share. And sometimes it's the struggles that teach us this lesson the deepest. Sophie and Emma ran over to them, hugging them tightly. "We love you, Daddy," they said with radiant smiles. Alexander felt his heart overflow with happiness. He had finally found what he had always been searching for: a real family. True love is not measured by what you gain, but by what you are willing to give. It is in the struggles that we discover what really matters, and it is in forgiveness that we find the chance to start over. The most valuable wealth isn't in money or power, but in the people we choose to love and protect, even when the road is difficult.